The rain fell with the kind of elegance that only nature could command, turning the streets into polished mirrors of the city lights. Miriam had spent the entire day navigating her executive meetings, attending board briefings, and handling her team with the quiet authority that came from 12 years of dedication. Every detail of her life was carefully curated, from the bespoke coat she wore to the designer briefcase that held her documents. Yet nothing she owned, nothing she had worked for, could shield her from what awaited her at home. She pulled her umbrella tighter against the sideways wind, her heels clicking against the wet cobblestones in a rhythm that almost seemed like a heartbeat, counting down to a moment she felt deep in her bones. Her intuition, honed by years of dealing with people who hid agendas behind polite smiles, whispered a warning she could not ignore. As she approached the grand iron gate of her home, a familiar chill ran through her. Her bags were outside, drenched, lined up like trophies of insult: her leatherwork bag, her designer travel bag, and the delicate floral overnight bag that belonged to her mother. They were soaked, abandoned, and utterly exposed to the rain, yet somehow they spoke louder than words. And then she saw them. Leonard stood on the porch, perfectly pressed shirt, the kind worn for guests or for theatrics, the arrogance of entitlement radiating from every line of his posture. Beside him, Vivian, younger, sharper, smiling with the precision of someone who believed life owed her what she wanted. And sitting on the step, shivering, her shawl doing nothing against the wet, was Grace, Miriam's mother. 71 years old, dignified, traveling 3 days to reach the city, and now forced into the humiliation of the rain. Leonard's voice cut through the sound of the storm, rehearsed and cruel. "You and your mother need to leave. Now, this is my house." Miriam stopped a few feet from the gate, every movement deliberate, every step a statement. She did not shout. She did not plead. She let her eyes move from Leonard to Vivian, assessing them the way a chess player sees her opponent, before a decisive move. Then she bent to help her mother to her feet, lifting the soaked basket of gifts with a calmness that belied the storm inside her. She turned her gaze to Leonard, her lips curling into a smile that was neither warmth nor malice. It was the smile of inevitability. Vivian's hand twitched on Leonard's arm, instinctively sensing that the woman before them had already written the ending of the story in her mind. "I heard you," Miriam said quietly, her voice carrying over the rain in a way that seemed to still the storm itself. She and her mother began walking, the soaked street reflecting their poise, their dignity, and the power of the life they had built, piece by piece, quietly, strategically. Neighbors pressed their faces to curtains, silently witnessing the march of justice that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with preparation. Grace, with her measured step, leaned on her walking stick, carrying the weight of decades of wisdom, of knowing exactly when to act, of knowing the power that comes from patience. By the time they reached Clara's house, a sanctuary of warmth and soft light, Miriam had made her decision. Nothing in the house she had left behind mattered more than the clarity she carried now. Clara greeted them without question, offering towels, tea, and quiet comfort. Grace moved like a general overseeing the aftermath of a carefully executed strategy, unpacking gifts and laying out documents, revealing the treasure Miriam had unknowingly carried all along, the original land title, stamped, registered, undeniable. Miriam's hands trembled slightly as she held it. But not from fear, from the realization that for 6 years, she had been patient, building a life, investing energy, trust, and love, only to be betrayed by the one person who had promised her forever. And now in her grasp was justice in its purest form. Clara suggested a lawyer. Miriam agreed, quietly, her mind already moving faster than anyone could follow. She didn't need dramatics. She needed precision, strategy, and timing. The same qualities that had built her career, her home, and her reputation. Douglas, the senior land registry official, arrived the next evening. His face carried guilt, but also respect, for the woman who had orchestrated her return to power without a word of hysteria, without a single misstep. he revealed Leonard's manipulation, the forged transfer, and the corruption that had attempted to claim what was never his. Miriam listened, absorbing every detail, filing every fact in her mind, preparing for the moment that would restore not just her property, but her sense of agency. 2 streets away, Leonard sat in the house that legally belonged to Miriam, watching the rain, realizing that every lie, every act of betrayal, was collapsing around him. Vivian, who thought she had seized a throne, was beginning to see it crumble. And the clock was ticking toward a reckoning neither of them could stop. By the following Monday, the legal machinery moved with deliberate precision. The court froze all transactions, debt collectors arrived, and news outlets reported the truth, exposing fraud, arrogance, and greed. The street that had once been silent now watched as Miriam returned to her rightful home. Not with celebration, but with measured steps, a leather folder in hand, holding the law, the truth, and the legacy of her mother's foresight. Leonard, standing on the threshold, whispered, "I have nowhere to go." Miriam's answer was simple, steady, and unshakable. "That is not my problem." She stepped aside and, together with Grace, entered the home that was always theirs. The rain fell on the red laterite road, tapping against windows, washing the garden, and carrying away the echoes of humiliation. Inside, the house was quiet, warm, restored. The kitchen smelled of Grace's cooking, the garden soil damp and ready for new life. There was no celebration, only calm, deliberate reclaiming of what had always been theirs. Grace stirred the pot, looked at her daughter, and said, softly but firmly, "A woman who knows what belongs to her never has to shout. She simply waits until the truth speaks." Miriam sat back, watching the rain, realizing for the first time in 6 years that power, patience, and preparation could not only restore what was lost, they could elevate life beyond what she had dared to imagine. And that, for now, was enough. The following morning, the rain had not stopped. It fell steadily, turning the streets into glistening reflections of city life, each drop a reminder of the chaos and clarity of the week before. Miriam woke early, before the city had fully stirred. She did not wake to alarms or notifications, but to the soft patter of rain against the window. The kind of sound that could wash a mind clean of confusion and prepare it for deliberate action. She moved through her restored home quietly, her steps deliberate on polished wooden floors. Every detail mattered. The curtains, the counters, the rooms, each had been touched by Vivian's brief occupation. But none of it would remain. Miriam had always understood that luxury life was not just about material wealth, it was about control. About setting standards for the environment around you. About cultivating a space that reflected your values, your discipline, your essence. She opened windows, letting the rain-scented air fill the house, and inspected the rooms with the calm precision of someone reclaiming not just property, but dignity. Grace entered the kitchen, carrying a tray with tea and a plate of pastries that smelled faintly of cinnamon and home. "You slept well?" she asked, her voice carrying the calm authority of 71 years of knowing how to survive storms, both literal and metaphorical. "I did," Miriam replied, taking the tea. Her eyes moved over the tray, noting the smallest details, the way the porcelain reflected the morning light, the warmth of the tea, the precision of her mother's arrangement. Luxury, she realized, was not only in wealth, but in the ability to shape world with intentionality. They spoke little. There was no need. The plan was already in motion. Miriam had spent years building a life of resilience and quiet influence. Now, every lesson, every hour of careful management, every decision to stay composed in the face of minor slights, all converged into a singular moment of reclaiming her destiny. By mid-morning, the lawyer Mr. Adu arrived. A tall man in a bespoke navy suit, carrying a leather briefcase that bore the faint sheen of Italian craftsmanship. He moved with the precision of someone who had been trained to operate in high-stakes situations, and yet he showed a deferential respect when Miriam and Grace welcomed him. "We have everything we need," Miriam said, her tone calm, almost casual. The original land title, witness statements, registry access logs, the confession from Douglas. Leonard will not see this coming. Adu nodded, opening his briefcase to lay out the documents. The freeze application will be filed immediately. Once the court grants it, Leonard will have no legal claim to the property, and any attempt to sell or leverage it will be intercepted. Miriam well protected. Miriam leaned back, sipping her tea. Good. Let's make sure this is done quietly, efficiently. I don't want spectacle, I want resolution. Grace smiled faintly, a glint in her eye that spoke of decades of foresight. You've learned well. Patience, timing, composure, your father would be proud. The day unfolded with meticulous planning. Miriam contacted her most trusted network, executives, legal experts, and investigative journalists she had collaborated with over the years. Every phone call was deliberate, every instruction precise. This was the kind of luxury life where influence and preparation outweighed impulsive emotion, where victory was measured not by immediate revenge but by long-term restoration and dominance. Meanwhile, 2 streets away, Leonard began to feel the first tremors of panic. The air inside the house, he believed, was heavy with unease. Vivian, who had been the confident queen of his borrowed castle, sensed the shift immediately. She found papers in a drawer, numbers, statements, correspondence, and her eyes narrowed. What is this? She asked Leonard, who avoided her gaze, his usual bluster fading like mist in the rain. It's nothing, he muttered. But she did not believe him. She could see the cracks forming in the world she thought she owned, and for the first time, she felt powerless. A sensation foreign and frightening. Back at Miriam's house, the journalist Victor arrived, carrying his camera and recording equipment. The plan was to document the evidence carefully, ethically, ensuring that the truth could not be hidden. Miriam allowed him to record conversations, statements, and documents, but she remained the calm center, never frantic, never dramatic. Every word she spoke was precise, every gesture deliberate. This was the luxury of control. Knowing that true power comes from preparation, not theatrics. By evening, the court had received the urgent freeze application. The judge, after reviewing the documents, granted the order, effectively immobilizing Leonard's ability to manipulate the property. The streets, which had watched the drama unfold a week earlier, now whispered about the woman who had reclaimed her world without screaming, without spectacle, yet with the absolute certainty of justice. Leonard called his financier, Silas, hoping to explain, negotiate, or delay. But Silas's response was calm, measured, and devastating in its clarity. The property was frozen, the debt unresolved, and any attempt to leverage the house further would be considered fraudulent. Leonard felt the walls closing in, not just legally, but socially. The street, once silent witnesses, now murmured about the arrogance and greed of a man undone by his own hubris. By the following morning, Miriam returned to her home, accompanied only by Grace. The rain had softened to a drizzle, leaving the world polished and clean, a reflection of the calm order Miriam had restored in her life. She opened the gates, stepped inside, and moved through her rooms with the quiet authority of someone who had built, lost, and now reclaimed her empire. She inspected the garden, noting the spaces where Vivian's fingers had pulled out her carefully planted peppers. She smiled faintly. Luxury life, she realized, was not just about wealth, it was about legacy, about creating a world that others cannot dismantle without your knowledge, your preparation, your patience. She could replant, redesign, improve. This was hers, fully and unshakably. Grace moved in gracefully through the kitchen, prepared a simple meal, the kind that spoke of comfort, stability, and quiet celebration. Miriam sat at the table, absorbing the satisfaction of a life restored, a wrong righted, and a lesson learned. The most luxurious form of living is mastery over one's own destiny. Later, Miriam would make her next moves, strategic, deliberate, ensuring that every party who had wronged her faced consequences proportionate to their actions. But for now she sat, sipping tea, watching the rain, and knowing that true power does not roar. It waits. It observes. And when the time comes, it moves with precision, grace, and inevitability. The storm outside had passed. Inside, a new order had begun, quiet yet unstoppable, the kind of life where wealth, power, and justice coexist seamlessly, for those who understand the rules of patience, preparation, and resilience. The morning after the court freeze, the city seemed different. The streets glistened with residual rain, reflections of neon signs and polished car surfaces casting fractured light across puddles. Miriam stepped onto her veranda, the leather folder from the previous day tucked neatly under her arm, her heels tapping against the stone, like a metronome marking deliberate action. She had not celebrated, nor had she rested. There was no joy in complacency. Luxury life demanded vigilance, strategy, and foresight. Grace followed, her shawl draped elegantly despite the damp air, holding the quiet authority of someone who had lived through storms far harsher than this. "The freeze will hold," she said calmly, her voice carrying the assurance of decades of experience. "But that is only the beginning. You know what must come next." Miriam nodded. She understood the layers of this fight. Legal victory was necessary, but it was insufficient. Leonard had thrived on deceit and arrogance. To ensure he could never harm them again, she needed leverage, strategy, and visibility. Her mind, hummed from years of corporate negotiation, moved quickly through possibilities. By late morning, she convened her trusted circle. Clara, the friend whose home had sheltered them, brought coffee and quiet support. Victor, the journalist, arranged his camera and notebook. Mr. Adu, the lawyer, outlined the next steps with precision, each measure designed to cement Miriam's ownership, protect against retaliation, and expose the depth of Leonard's fraud. The first move was documentation. Victor would compile photographs, recordings, witness statements, and correspondence into a portfolio so comprehensive it could not be ignored. Every board meeting, every construction payment, every interaction with Leonard's financiers would be tracked. Every detail mattered. Luxury life, Miriam reflected, was not just about wealth, it was about control, influence, and narrative. By afternoon, Douglas, the registry official, met them at Miriam's house. He handed over all the files, the forged transfer documents, registry access logs, and a detailed account of Leonard's requests. He believed the original title was gone, Douglas admitted, his voice low. "He underestimated your mother, and he underestimated you." Miriam studied the documents carefully, her hands steady, her eyes scanning every signature, stamp, and annotation. She was not angry. Anger had been useful on the porch, but now she needed clarity. She had patience, precision, and leverage, luxury tools more powerful than emotion. "This is enough to start," she said quietly. Meanwhile, Leonard and Vivian were unraveling. Vivian had spent the morning rearranging rooms, only to find documents she could not comprehend. Numbers and letters that hinted at a world she had never truly understood. Leonard avoided her gaze, attempting to maintain composure, but the panic was evident. His empire, constructed on lies and borrowed authority, was crumbling. He could feel it in the calculated silence of the street, in the whispers of neighbors who witnessed Miriam's return, and her command over events. By evening, Miriam took the next step. She would confront Leonard directly, not with emotion, but with authority and evidence. She arrived at the gate, her designer coat buttoned neatly, umbrella folded under her arm. She did not shout, plead, or demand. She simply knocked, the sound precise, deliberate, echoing across the rain-soaked street. Leonard opened the door, and for the first time he saw her not as a wife, but as a force of inevitability. "I am here to inform you," Miriam said, her voice calm, carrying authority. "By Monday morning, you will receive formal communication from my lawyer and the fraud investigation unit. You will have the opportunity to cooperate fully. That is the only courtesy I am extending." Leonard's face shifted through disbelief, panic, and finally, a kind of quiet despair. "I have nowhere to go," he muttered, echoing the emptiness of his choices. Miriam did not respond with triumph or cruelty. She simply turned, walked away, and allowed the quiet power of the rain, the street, and the law to speak on her behalf. Behind her, Leonard remained, powerless, while the women he had sought to humiliate reclaimed both dignity and space. By the next morning, the freeze order had been formally lodged. Leonard's creditors arrived, debt notices in hand, and realized the house could no longer be leveraged. Silas, the financier, recalculated his position and left with a restrained acknowledgement of the legal barrier. Meanwhile, the journalist published the story. Photographs of Grace holding the original land title, detailed accounts of Leonard's fraud, and Miriam's statement that was calm, precise, and devastating in its clarity. Vivian, seeing the collapse of the world she thought she had seized, packed quietly and left through the back gate. No dramatic farewells, no protest. Just the understanding that she had misread the room, the timing, and the consequences of underestimating a woman prepared, patient and precise. Miriam returned home. Walking through the familiar rooms, inspecting the garden, and noting where she would replant. She observed the work her mother had already begun in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal that spoke of comfort, resilience and continuity. She understood that luxury life was not about opulence alone, but about control, self-respect, and the ability to recover fully, gracefully, and strategically from betrayal. The rain fell gently outside, a reminder that storms pass and clarity remains. Miriam poured herself tea, feeling the warmth in her hands and in her chest. Grace, watching her daughter, offered a soft smile. Patience, preparation, composure, she said quietly. You put them all to use today. Miriam nodded. She had learned well. And now, with the house fully restored, the legal system aligned, and her mother's wisdom guiding her, she could look forward to building a life that was not only safe but extraordinary. Luxury, she understood, was never just about money. It was about mastery over one's own destiny. And so, the city continued, unaware that it had just witnessed a quiet revolution. A woman reclaimed her home, her legacy, and her power, not through noise, not through rage, but through calculated patience, preparation, and the confidence that comes with knowing what truly belongs to you cannot be stolen. By the following morning, the city seemed to hum with anticipation. Rain had eased into a gentle mist, leaving streets glistening and air crisp. A world washed clean, waiting for clarity. Miriam walked through her house with measured steps, inspecting every detail. The kitchen counters gleamed. The living room reflected her authority. The garden, though temporarily barren where Vivian had ripped out her peppers, held the promise of renewal. Everything bore witness to her patience, her preparation, her quiet dominance. Grace moved beside her, calm, attentive, the wisdom of 71 years guiding her daughter's every choice. The next steps, Grace said softly, are the most important. You have reclaimed what was yours, but you must secure it fully. Leonard and his accomplices will test boundaries, they always do. The difference is now you control the rules. Miriam nodded. She had learned well. The luxury life she pursued was not only about wealth or comfort. It was about influence, foresight, and unshakable authority. Every action she would take now would be deliberate, calculated, and irreversible. By late morning, Mr. Ado filed the full case at the regional court, including the original land title, Douglas's confession, registry access logs, witness statements, and a precise, detailed account of Leonard's manipulations. Every page, every signature, every stamp testified to one truth. Leonard had built his claim on fraud, and the rightful ownership rested with Miriam. The judge reviewed the case immediately and scheduled an urgent hearing. While the legal wheels turned, Miriam engaged her strategic allies. Clara coordinated media coverage, ensuring the story would reach the right platforms without sensationalism. Portraying Miriam not as a victim, but as a woman reclaiming her life, her home, and her dignity. Victor, the journalist, refined his recordings, interviews, and photographs, ready to publish a follow-up piece that would solidify public awareness and safeguard her legacy. 2 streets away, Leonard and Vivian sat in the house he had no legal right to occupy. Vivian's sharp eyes scanned the rooms, noting empty spaces where her decorative touches once stood. Her confidence, which had thrived on perceived power, now wavered. Leonard, once commanding, now shuffled papers and avoided eye contact. His usual arrogance replaced with tension, doubt, and fear. The financial notices from Silas still sat in the doorframe, a constant reminder that debt and exposure had caught up with him. By mid-afternoon, Miriam arrived at the courthouse. She walked past the polished floors and columns, with the composure of someone accustomed to command. She carried only the leather folder with her evidence and a notebook where she had detailed her strategy. Anticipating every question, every objection, every attempt at delay, luxury life was not about rushing, it was about control, timing, and decisiveness. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors, local journalists, and legal representatives watched as Leonard was summoned. He appeared tense, fidgeting with the cuffs of his shirt, unable to maintain the facade of confidence he had worn on the porch days earlier. Vivian, seated quietly beside him, looked smaller than she had ever felt. A throne of ambition now stripped bare. Miriam entered calmly, her presence commanding. She did not rush to the front. She allowed the room to adjust to her authority, to recognize that she was not here to plead or protest, but to execute justice with precision and clarity. Every step, every glance, every gesture conveyed certainty. When the proceedings began, Mr. Dew presented the evidence meticulously. The forged transfer documents, Douglas's written confession, and the original title were laid out. Each piece was examined, verified, and placed in full context. Miriam's calm testimony cut through the tension, her voice steady, her words deliberate. This property has always belonged to me. My mother purchased and registered it in my name before my marriage. Leonard's claim was built on deception. I am here to restore what is rightfully mine, and to ensure accountability for the fraud committed. Leonard's protest faltered under the weight of undeniable evidence. Vivian whispered in his ear, but there was no reassurance to be found. The judge, after reviewing the documentation and listening to the testimony, confirmed the freeze and ordered full restitution to Miriam. The house, the land, and all associated rights were legally restored. Leonard's fraudulent attempts were documented and reported, exposing him to civil and potential criminal consequences. As Miriam exited the courthouse, the rain had returned, gentle and unhurried. She did not hurry. She did not rush. The streets, aware of her victory, seemed to bow subtly under the rhythm of her steps. Luxury life, she realized, was not in the noise of triumph, it was in the composure of victory, the quiet dominance of preparation, and the assurance that injustice had been corrected. When she returned home, she moved through her rooms deliberately. The walls bore her vision, the garden awaited her care, and the air smelled of rain and renewal. Grace was there, quietly preparing tea, her hands skilled and steady. Together, they sat at the kitchen table, drinking warmth and calm, their gaze out the window at the rain, slick streets that had watched betrayal and now witnessed reclamation. Miriam spoke softly, more to herself than anyone else. Control is the greatest luxury. Patience is the greatest power. Preparation is the greatest wealth. And now, every room, every step, every moment in this house is mine, fully, unassailable, and restored. Grace reached across the table, placing her hand over her daughter's. You did more than reclaim property today. You reclaimed dignity, authority, and legacy. That is the true wealth. Miriam nodded. She understood fully now that luxury life was not merely about material possessions, but about influence, vision, and control over the narrative of one's destiny. The storms outside were gone. Inside, a woman who had been thrown out in the rain now commanded her world with quiet power, elegance, and inevitability. The final act was unfolding naturally. Leonard and Vivian's world unraveled, not through vengeance, but through the calculated, precise, unstoppable authority of a woman who had never lost sight of what was hers. The neighborhood, the city, and the networks that mattered watched as justice quietly, inevitably, and luxuriously prevailed. Miriam walked through her home, room by room, taking note of what to repair, what to redesign, and what to leave untouched. A life rebuilt with intention, control, and unshakable confidence. She had faced betrayal, injustice, and humiliation, and emerged not only restored, but elevated, with the lessons of patience, composure, and foresight embedded in every fiber of her being. The rain fell softly outside, the streets polished and bright, reflecting a life restored, a house reclaimed, and a legacy secured. Miriam and Grace together sat in the quiet warmth of their home. Luxury was not only wealth. It was mastery, foresight, preparation, and the unwavering ability to claim what was always rightfully yours. And for the first time in a long time, Miriam smiled. Not in triumph, not in revenge, but in the calm, unshakable satisfaction of a life fully reclaimed and a destiny fully controlled. Weeks passed, and the city began to settle into a rhythm once again. But Miriam's life had changed in ways that went far beyond the restoration of property. The house on Clement Street was no longer just a home, it was a statement. Every corner, every room, every detail reflected her vision, elegant, purposeful, and unassailable. The rooms were flooded with light that fell on polished floors and carefully curated furnishings. The garden bloomed under her careful attention. Pepper plants, flowering shrubs, and ornamental trees creating a sanctuary of growth and resilience. Grace moved with quiet grace through the kitchen, her hands skilled and sure, preparing meals that were simple yet luxurious in their attention to quality and detail. The aroma of fresh herbs and rich spices filled the home. Miriam watched, sipping her tea, feeling the weight everything that had happened lift from her shoulders. The storm of betrayal had passed, and now, what remained was clarity, control, and opportunity. Miriam had learned that luxury life was not about material wealth alone. It was about agency, strategy, and influence. She had reclaimed her home, her property and dignity, and now she was ready to expand the influence of her restored life. Her career in health administration, long sustained by quiet diligence and integrity, became a platform for broader initiatives. She began mentoring young women in corporate strategy, leadership, and personal empowerment, teaching them that wealth without agency was hollow, and that true luxury was the ability to navigate life with unshakable control and foresight. Her first act of public empowerment was subtle but unmistakable. Victor, the journalist, published a follow-up piece titled, "A Woman Who Waited for the Truth: How Patience and Preparation Restore Power." The article highlighted Miriam's measured approach, her mother's quiet support, and the strategic precision with which she reclaimed her home and legacy. The piece went viral across social media platforms. Comments poured in admiration, inspiration, and gratitude from women who had faced injustice, betrayal, and underestimation. Miriam's story became a blueprint, a motivational guide for anyone seeking control over their life and destiny. Meanwhile, Leonard and Vivian faced the consequences of their choices. Leonard was under investigation for fraud, and civil actions were filed to recover financial losses caused by his actions. Vivian, who had once believed she had claimed a throne built on deceit, found herself displaced, having misread every signal, every room, and every person. The lesson for them was not shouted or enforced with malice. It was the quiet consequence of Miriam's preparation, foresight, and unwavering patience. Luxury, she knew, was most potent when it manifested without noise, yet left an indelible impact. Miriam's mornings became rituals of clarity and power. She rose early, dressed with elegance and precision, and walked through her garden, noting the growth of each plant, each tree, each corner of her sanctuary. She would take calls, review documents, and plan initiatives that extended her influence beyond her home, beyond the streets she had once walked drenched and abandoned. Her nights were reserved for reflection and strategy. She had learned that a woman who understands her worth, her rights, and her potential can transform adversity into opportunity. Grace, proud and steady, watched her daughter thrive. "You have mastered more than property," she said one evening as they shared tea by the window. "You have mastered patience, authority, and the subtle art of ensuring justice without needing to shout. That is the essence of power and the true mark of luxury." Miriam smiled. She knew her mother was right. The elegance of her victory lay not in spectacle but in precision. She had turned betrayal into strategy, injustice into empowerment, and humiliation into a platform for lasting influence and legacy. The rain that had once soaked her bags, her mother's shawl, and her pride had passed, leaving clarity, renewal, and the unshakable foundation of control over her destiny. In the months that followed, Miriam expanded her life beyond what she had imagined. She purchased additional properties, not for extravagance but for influence, for security and for the cultivation of spaces that reflected the values she had learned: resilience, foresight, and strategic empowerment. She hosted gatherings for thought leaders, mentors, and proteges, creating an environment where ideas flourished and influence was shared, not hoarded. The world began to recognize Miriam, not just as a woman who had been wronged and reclaimed her life, but as a visionary, a strategist, and a model of empowered living. Luxury life, she demonstrated, was about elegance in thought, power in patience, and mastery over circumstances. Evenings in the house became rituals of reflection and gratitude. She and Grace would sit in the living room, observing the city lights through wide windows, sipping tea, and discussing the subtleties of life, influence, and strategy. Miriam understood that the true luxury of life was sovereignty over one's choices, and the ability to shape outcomes with clarity and calm authority. When the rains returned, as they inevitably did, Miriam no longer feared them. She welcomed the sound on her roof and the scent in the air, reminders that storms pass, but preparation, patience, and persistence leave enduring results. She had walked through humiliation and betrayal, emerged unbroken, and transformed her challenges into a life of power, dignity, and refinement. Leonard's downfall was complete, not because Miriam sought vengeance, but because she understood the quiet, devastating efficacy of preparation, patience, and legal and moral authority. Vivian's departure marked the final closure of a chapter built on deceit. Every step Miriam took forward now was deliberate luxury in motion. A life not only restored but elevated beyond the reach of those who underestimated her. The house on Clement Street became a symbol, not of wealth alone, but of mastery, elegance, and strategic empowerment. Miriam and Grace moved through it with purpose, understanding that true luxury is the union of authority, vision, and the unshakable confidence that comes from owning your destiny. And in that house, under the soft glow of warm lights and the gentle patter of rain, Miriam finally allowed herself to rest in the comfort of a life reclaimed, a legacy restored, and a future entirely her own. She had been thrown out in the rain, humiliated and betrayed, but what she did next, through patience, precision, and unwavering composure, shocked everyone, transformed her life, and established her as a woman whose authority and influence could never be questioned again. Luxury was never about the house, the money, or appearances. Luxury was mastery over circumstances, strategic patience, and the quiet, unstoppable power of knowing what belongs to you will always return. Miriam poured herself a final cup of tea that evening, Grace beside her, and looked out at the rain-soaked streets with calm authority. The storm had passed. The house was hers. The legacy was secured. And the woman who had once stood drenched in humiliation now stood at the pinnacle of her own power, dignity, and unshakable influence. The rain fell outside, but inside, Miriam and Grace were warm, restored, and unbroken. And that, beloved, is the luxury of a life fully reclaimed.